gamers, and welcome back. I'm Rob, of course, or Warshack if you want to call me by my in-game name. And in this video, we're going to be going over deck building tips for you beginner to intermediate Hearthstone players that are having difficulty kind of exploring and deck building. You're not really sure where to start, what to even what should the foundation of a deck look like, and while you're building the deck, what are you trying to piece together to make work, right? There's a lot of questions when deck building, and there's a lot of it's very scary, right? Because when you deck build and you're playing a deck that's never before yet been played, or you yourself just haven't played, or you're not sure it's how it's going to perform, you go in a ranked game and you get absolutely crushed by someone who isn't playing their own deck. They just copied it off of online, and it kind of sways you away from wanting to build your own decks and more so just wanting to copy other people's decks that have already proven to work, right? So this is kind of where this video is going to come in to help you guys explore your own deck archetypes and your ideas a little bit further, and maybe give you a little insight onto what either you're missing or you just kind of looked over, because it's very, if you've never really played a card game and you've never built a deck, building a deck in a card game you've never played or don't play that often or don't just, or new at, is very difficult. So with that said, we'll get into our first tip here. Don't think these tips go from like step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. This is just a general process of kind of checks and balances and just looking over things to make sure you do while building the deck. So the first tip, or the first, I should say, note that we're going to talk about is net decking and copying other players' decks, which at some point in your Hearthstone career, it's going to happen. And when you do so, you should do it properly. And I've seen a lot of people do it wrong. So let's get into that. The reason I wanted to cover this first is because net decking and copying is probably the #1 way that people deck build. So I wanted to cover exactly when you copy someone's deck, what you need to look for and do other than just copy it. Because if you just copy the deck and play with it, more times than not, you're going to lose to things that you could probably have turned around and won the game. And the reason is that you don't pay attention to the author's notes and basically what the person who did build the deck has to say about the deck. So as we can see here, it's really not hard to find a deck list. If you're looking for a specific month, if you're looking for a tier, it breaks it down. It's going to show you the deck list. It tells you exactly what kind of deck it is, whether it's Miracle Rogue, Dragon Warrior, Priest. You can break it down again into other websites. There's a plethora of decks for you to copy. Don't get me wrong, copying a deck is not the hard part here. The hard part, or I would have to say this, the part that's going to separate you, the person copying a deck, versus the other person who's copying either the same deck or a deck of the same caliber, is the fact that how much knowledge do you have behind this deck? You personally didn't build it, so you really don't know the inner workings, what the synergies are, what the win condition is. The only real way to learn that is to play with the deck, which you haven't played with it before because you're net decking it. And the other way that you can learn that is to read the author's notes, like I mentioned before. As silly as that seems, reading what the person has to say who built the deck that you're wanting to play is very important, because they've played with it a lot more than you and have a lot of probably good insights that you won't be able to pick up until quite a few games in. And at that point, you might have lost due to an insight that you could have easily just read over the course of 5 to 10 minutes in the description of that particular deck, other than just losing a whole bunch and then coming to either me or another player asking, why are you losing with a tier 1 deck? You have no, I have no idea why I'm losing. I'm playing the best deck. I should at least be winning 50% of the time. And it all comes down to understanding the deck, which again comes from paying attention to what the author has to say about it. I know that seems a bit silly, but it's basically the #1 way people build decks. And I figured it was definitely worth mentioning in there that you should pay attention to, all of the description and all of the information about it, other than just copy pasting, and hopefully it gets you just multiple wins and just carries you basically through ladder. So synergies within a deck is something that you almost build the premise of whatever deck you're trying to build, right? When you're building a deck, you're looking for it to do a specific thing, whether you're playing a tempo mage, a dragon warrior, a control deck. There's this overlying, you want all the cards to somehow mash together and work very well with one another. The problem comes when you try to mix basically too many synergies, or the synergies you're trying to mix are just too much for the deck to handle. So for example, a very easy synergy a deck can have would be to add Flamewaker. We look at Flamewaker, which is a mage card. It's a 3 mana 2/4. After you cast a spell, deal 2 damage, randomly split among all enemies. So you're like, okay, well, obviously with the mage class, there's most likely going to be a large quantity of spells within the deck, right? And with that being said, the spells by themselves are good. Flamewaker almost by himself is good. You know, a 3-mana 2/4 is not the most powerful, but he's not absolutely terrible by himself. And in combination, the two become very powerful and synergize well with one another, right? But then we look at other cards such as Medormu, and then we take a look at his combo pieces. Which, oh gosh, let's bring that up a little bit. Sorry about that. And we look at this guy's combo pieces, which I've seen a lot of people play this deck, or decks like it, that require a bunch of different synergies to work together, all specifically at certain times in the game, under certain conditions, and it makes the synergies a lot harder to pull off, which makes the deck a lot more inconsistent. So for example, people will want to kill the Medormu here, which turns your hero power into a Ragnaros hero power, which does 8 damage for 2 mana. From then, you would need to use your hero power more than once per turn to be able to deal 8 damage to a lot of different things, or to just win the game in one turn, which then you'd use the Caldera Drake. Then on top of that, what if you want to use your hero power more than just 5 times? You would have to use Maid in the Lake. So not only do you have to use the Medormu to change your hero power, which is going to bring your health down to 8, which is part of his ability, you also have to have these 2 other cards, which have to at least be on the field a turn or 2 to then hopefully be able to pull off this combo. So I know this is a bit extreme when I'm saying for synergies and, you know, win conditions and whatnot, but it's very important that you understand that the synergies you pick within the deck shouldn't be just one explosive big synergy and that's what you're looking for, and that's like how the deck wins, is just this one huge combo, right? Not to say that's a bad way to play Hearthstone. There's decks revolving around that do perform okay, and they're really fun to play. So don't get me wrong, you can build like decks like that if you're looking to, you know, win 1 out of 10 games, and it's just that's what brings you satisfaction, is pulling off that one combo. But if you're looking to play, you know, a very consistent deck that's gonna keep, like, every other game or every game you should be pulling off synergies within your card. It shouldn't be difficult to get that synergy action going on. You know, making sure that cards like Flamewaker and then just cheap spells, like, that's a synergy in itself, and it's just every game that's going to be able to happen, unlike a combination of cards like this. I know that was a bit of an extreme example, but I figured the Flamewaker was a very simplistic one, while this one being a little bit more extreme, and hopefully that kind of gets across the point. So our tip number 3 is going to be win condition, and what I mean by that is basically what makes your deck powerful, right? Like, during matches, what is going to be what pushes your deck forward and allows you to win most of your games. Let's say, for example, we're looking at the Dragon Tempo Warrior. This deck runs, like I mentioned, dragons, and the word tempo means you're playing them basically on curve, and you're out, I don't want to say resourcing, but you're playing too many minions. Your opponent can't get rid of them all, and by the time they can, you know, deal with what you've thrown out on the board, whether it be through minions or through spells, it's too late. You've dealt too much damage, and you're just too far ahead in the match for your opponent to either outvalue or to out-tempo you once more. So with that being said, you know, you're building your Tempo Dragon Warrior, and you think it's really cool if you throw in, you know, some Murlocs, or you want to throw in a Cthulhu win condition, or you want to go, you know, I need a Cthulhu and a Leroy Jenkins, or, you know, you like to have Reno because while you're trying to do burst, you're taking too much damage because you're playing too many cards in your deck, and you're not playing them because you're looking for some synergies within cards, and you need them all at one time. So all of a sudden your deck is transformed from what was a Dragon Tempo Warrior to like all of these archetypes combined into one deck, and now your deck is just losing. And the reason being is that your win condition has been skewed, and your power of the deck has been skewed in so many different ways that the deck cannot do everything at once, right? So I found it very beneficial to me, because this is actually what I did when I first started. I thought, well, why don't I just play this deck and combined with this deck into that deck, and then I have the power of 4 different decks in one. It's fantastic. But the problem when you do this, it makes the deck very inconsistent, because you'll end up drawing pieces of each, and you won't be able to really, no single one will really shine through on its power level, right? Because you're getting a little bit of each thing, and a little bit of each isn't going to work well, for example. So it's best to just kind of tone back and just play one thing at a time. And then, you know, maybe you'll add an additional feature. So maybe you'll add, you know, if you're thinking Dragon Tempo, you could add in the Pirate package, for example, for the early game for the Dragons. But most of the time, I find a lot of players kind of overextending and over wanting to reach what the deck is built to do, and kind of losing sight of how they win and how the deck is supposed to perform. So if you end up, wanting to add things to the deck, just add them in pieces. Don't just go crazy and then lose sight of what the deck is supposed to be doing. So that hopefully that helps you out on the win condition, and kind of like when building the deck, don't try to do too many things at one time. Keep it simple, to the point, and expand from there. Our fourth tip is going to be counter the meta. So I know for beginners or intermediate players, this might be a little bit more difficult than an advanced tip for deck building, but it still should be mentioned because it's very important. So there's going to be tons of different resources for you online through Google and websites that kind of show you what the game is currently looking like, what is the most popular class being played. So for example, right now looking over here, we can see that Shaman is probably the most popular class played, with Aggro Shaman and Mid-Range Shaman being most of that, followed by Pirate Warrior and then Dragon Warrior. So with that being said, we would look at what's in that deck, and then what could we put in our particular deck that we're wanting to play to counter that deck, right? So for example, Acidic Swamp Ooze, which destroys weapons, is very powerful not only against Shaman, but also against Warrior, because both those classes have weapons. So I know this is, again, a more advanced tip, but it's very important that whatever deck you're trying to play or trying to build, you need to keep in mind what are the most powerful and popular decks being played at that moment, and that's going to change over time. So as you build decks, you're not going to tech in or put in the same counter cards, because as I've mentioned, times change, decks change, and what is once powerful, what is powerful today isn't necessarily going to be what's the most played and popular deck 2 weeks from now or even a week from now. So just knowing what you need to counter and how to counter it is very important, and Google has plenty of that information. I'm sure these charts will change 2 or 3 weeks from now. Maybe not. Shaman's been pretty powerful for quite some time now, but just knowing kind of which cards to replace and how to counter them, like I mentioned, is very important into deck building new decks that may not be the strongest deck at the time, but you can make it strong by countering what is strong at that particular time. Our last tip is probably the most important, and what's going to make your overall deck building experience kind of get better over time, and that's testing and adjusting the deck from playing it, right? So for example, you're playing a deck, you're finding that you either, you're lacking draw, you always have no cards in your hand. When your opponents seem to be playing big minions, you can't deal with them. All of these things you need to be taking into account are particular cards sitting in your hand for extended periods of time where you're just not getting any use out of them. Like you'll find that 60 or 70% of your games that, for example, this one card is always in your hand and it's always doing nothing. Like the situation for it to be good has just not arrived. It's just not there. These are the cards that you need to kind of keep a check mark of in your head, and then go back and change them with cards that in that particular situation, or you keep finding yourself in those situations, would be good with. And that's kind of where the deck building really takes place, and is what is going to drive the deck that you're trying to test and build to the next level. If you're not testing and adjusting the deck based on what you see is and is not working, the deck is never going to get better. Sometimes you actually do build a really solid deck and you only need to change 1 or 2 cards. Sometimes you build a deck, the entire deck just is trash. It's happened many times with me where we've decided we wanted to try a particular deck. We've played it and we just keep losing. We change cards, we just keep losing. We change cards, we just keep losing. So it's like, all right, well, this deck sucks. Well, it's good time to build a new deck. So just keep in mind that no deck is going to be perfect at first, and you're only going to make it better over time. And that only comes with playing and adjusting. And with playing and adjusting, you have to keep mental notes of kind of what is working and what isn't, and that comes with trying. Like you're not gonna, like, this is a very long and drawn out process of making decks actually work, and it's not just you throw something together and it's just gonna work the first time, which a lot of players think that's the way it is. And behind the scenes, before and even after I do our deck testings and our deck guides, there's a lot of stuff that you don't see me do, of me playing and me changing cards, just even 1 or 2 cards. Then we'll play 30 games with just a 1 card change and see how that performs versus the other way. So there's a lot of intricacies that come with deck building, and it's definitely not for everybody, but for those of you who want to, start building your own decks and want to push forward, I think these tips are a great way to start. Again, these are like beginner to intermediate tips. These aren't the expert based tips, which would then be very specific to certain classes and even certain cards at that point. So again, this was kind of general, and I tried to reach out to as many of you as possible and kind of give you the insights on what you need to look into. So if you've enjoyed, perfect. Leave me a comment in the section below if you think I've missed anything, or if you'd like to add on to whatever I've said, because of course I can't cover everything I want to. For those players looking for further kind of explanations or resources, I'm sure the comment section will have some great things for you to look at as well, because everybody on this channel is great and everybody's all open to helping each other out, which is fantastic. So I'll end this here. As always, guys, I'm Warshack, of course, and happy whatever the hell day it is.